If you like this sort of content, consider supporting on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you. Last year, I made a video about 6 of the UK's most infamous crimes. Obviously, there was no way I could leave it there, so I decided it was time I covered more of them. I'm terrible at intros, so let's just get right into it. Here are 6 more of the most shocking crimes in British history. Just like in the last video, we're starting with an infamous child killer. Last time it was John Venables and Robert Thompson. This time it's a girl named Mary Bell. Born on May 26, 1957 in Newcastle upon Tyne, Mary was the first child of Betty Bell, a 16-year-old sex worker, and an unknown father, although Billy Bell, a local criminal, later became her stepfather. From the very beginning, Mary's life was marked by chaos and instability. Betty was reportedly abusive towards Mary from infancy. Family members and neighbours would later claim that Betty had tried to kill her daughter multiple times, with one of the most alarming stories being that Betty allegedly attempted to give her away to a woman who had recently lost a child. Mary's life was full of such harrowing incidents. Betty's profession as a sex worker exposed Mary to extreme forms of neglect and inappropriate behaviour. She was left alone for long periods of time, and, disturbingly, it is believed that Betty may have coerced Mary into engaging in acts with her clients by the time she was 5 years old. These experiences left deep psychological scars on the young girl, fostering an environment of trauma that many psychologists later speculated contributed to her sociopathic tendencies. Mary's school years were no less troubling. She exhibited disturbing behaviour from a young age, displaying aggression towards other children and frequently engaging in violent outbursts. Teachers and students noted that Mary seemed to have an unusual fascination with death and harm. Her classmates recalled that she enjoyed bullying younger children and was often caught fighting. Even at home, Mary was known to have strangled animals and, on one occasion, suffocated a pet pigeon to death in front of other children. While these were clear signs of deeper psychological issues, Mary's troubling behaviour was largely overlooked by authorities, as she slipped through the cracks of the social system that might have been able to intervene. By 1968, at the age of 10, Mary's violent impulses culminated in 2 horrific murders. On May 25, 1968, just one day before her 11th birthday, Mary lured 4-year-old Martin Brown into an abandoned house in Scotswood, Newcastle. There, she strangled the young boy to death. Afterward, Mary and her friend, Norma Bell, no relation, returned to the scene of the crime, where they vandalized the building and left crude notes claiming responsibility for the murder. Authorities initially suspected Martin's death had been a tragic accident, as no clear signs of violence were immediately evident. However, the truth behind the boy's death became clear only after Mary struck again. On July 31, 1968, just 2 months after Martin's murder, Mary and Norma lured 3-year-old Brian Howe to a remote area near a railway line. Once again, Mary strangled her young victim, this time escalating her violence by mutilating his body. She used a pair of scissors to cut his hair, scratch his thighs, and carve the letter M into his stomach. It was this level of cruelty, along with her chilling composure following the act, that eventually led to authorities to focus on Mary as a suspect. Unlike her first victim, Brian's body bore clear signs of a deliberate and sadistic attack, and it was clear to police that this death had been anything but accidental. During the investigation, Mary's behaviour became increasingly suspicious. She would visit the homes of the grieving families, showing little emotion as she asked questions about the funerals and the investigations. At one point, she even laughed when asked about her involvement in the crimes. Her lack of remorse and odd detachment was startling, especially for someone so young. It was only after Norma, who had been present during both murders but did not actively participate, confessed to the police that the full extent of Mary's involvement came to light. The trial of Mary Bell began in 1968, and it immediately attracted widespread media attention. The image of an 11-year-old girl standing in the dock accused of such heinous crimes shocked the public, and the case was extensively covered by newspapers across the country. The trial revealed the full extent of Mary's troubling upbringing, with experts testifying that her abusive environment had contributed to her actions. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with a psychopathic personality disorder, noting that she displayed a complete lack of empathy and emotional connection to her crimes. During the trial, Mary remained unnervingly calm and emotionless, even when confronted with details of the crimes she had committed. At one point, when the judge asked Mary how she felt when she murdered the children, she responded coldly, quote, "I don't know." This chilling indifference was a key factor in the jury's decision. Although Mary was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, the verdict was based on the fact that she was suffering from diminished responsibility due to her mental state. Norma Bell, who had also been charged with murder, was acquitted after the jury determined that she had been heavily influenced by Mary and had played a passive role in the killings. Mary was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, a form of indefinite detention reserved for young offenders. The sentence meant that Mary could be held as long as the authorities deemed necessary, depending on her rehabilitation and progress. She was initially sent to Red Bank Secure Unit, where she began serving her sentence. During her time in custody, Mary was known to exhibit troubling behavior, though over the years she appeared to stabilize. Mary Bell spent 12 years in various secure facilities before being released in 1980 at the age of 23. By then, she had spent more than half her life in detention. Upon her release, she was granted a new identity to protect her from the media and potential vigilante attacks. The public, however, remained divided over her release. While some believed that Mary had paid for her crimes and deserved a chance of rehabilitation, others argued that she should never have been allowed to walk free, given the severity of her actions. Following her release, Mary lived a relatively quiet and anonymous life. In 1984, she gave birth to a daughter, who was unaware of her mother's true identity for many years. However, in 1998, the press discovered Mary's whereabouts and her new identity was revealed, leading to a media frenzy. In response, Mary was granted a lifelong court order protecting both her and her daughter's identities, making it illegal for the media to publish any information that could reveal her location or personal details, just like John Venables and Robert Thompson. While Mary has stayed out of trouble since her release and has been able to become a mother and even grandmother, both she and her family know what she did, and that's something they'll carry for the rest of their lives. On June 2, 2010, the rural and peaceful community of Cumbria, England, was shaken to its core by one of the deadliest mass shootings in British history. Over the course of 3.5 hours, Derek Bird, a 52-year-old taxi driver, embarked on a murderous rampage that left 12 people dead and 11 others seriously injured. The spree would end in tragedy and confusion as a quiet and unassuming man turned a typical summer day into a nightmare that would haunt the region forever. Derek Bird was born on November 8, 1957, in Whitehaven, Cumbria, into a relatively ordinary working-class family. He had a twin brother, David Bird, with whom he shared a close, though ultimately strained relationship. Raised in the coastal region of Cumbria, Derek and David grew up in a rural setting where they were relatively insulated from urban life. Bird spent most of his life in or around the Cumbria area, and his deep familiarity with the landscape would later play a role in his ability to evade capture during his rampage. Bird's early life was unremarkable by most standards. He attended the local school system and didn't exhibit any significant behavioral issues. After leaving school, he worked various manual labor jobs and eventually trained to become a self-employed taxi driver, a career that suited his introverted and solitary nature. By his 20s, Bird had settled into his role as a hard-working though quiet man who seemed to get along with most people but kept to himself. Despite his relatively normal early life, Bird's personal relationships, particularly with his family, became increasingly complicated as he got older. While his bond with his twin brother David was initially strong, it later deteriorated due to financial disputes and jealousy, tensions that would fester over the years. Derek Bird's personal life was marked by turbulence, especially in his relationships with women. He had been married but later divorced, with the dissolution of his marriage being a significant blow to his emotional stability. Bird and his ex-wife had 2 sons, but following the divorce, his relationships with his children became more distant. He remained a provider and saw his sons periodically, but Bird's isolation grew deeper after his divorce, and the loneliness became a prominent feature in his life. Although Bird had a few romantic relationships after his divorce, none were particularly long-lasting, and he never remarried. Friends and acquaintances described him as being quiet and somewhat socially awkward, often withdrawing from social interactions. His life primarily revolved around his work as a taxi driver, and while he was well known among other drivers, he often kept to himself, harboring unspoken grievances. He worked as a taxi driver for over 2 decades in the Whitehaven area. To many of his colleagues, he appeared to be a somewhat friendly, albeit distant, individual who preferred to stick to a regular routine. However, Bird had a growing sense of frustration in his personal life. Taxi driving is a competitive and often challenging profession, especially in rural areas like Cumbria, where fares can be scarce. Bird had issues with some of his fellow taxi drivers, particularly with Darren Rucastle. Bird believed that Rucastle had been undercutting him on fares and treating him poorly. While most of these grievances seemed trivial to outsiders, for Bird, they fed into his growing sense of resentment and paranoia, making him feel marginalized and mistreated in both his professional and personal life. Bird's life was increasingly dominated by financial problems. He had accumulated a substantial tax debt and was under investigation by HM Revenue and Customs for tax irregularities. Bird feared that he would be imprisoned for tax evasion, and his inability to find a way out of his financial predicament left him feeling trapped. This looming threat of financial ruin became an all-consuming source of stress for Bird. He became convinced that people close to him, particularly his twin brother David and his solicitor, Kevin Commons, were plotting against him. Bird believed that David and Kevin were working together to turn him into the tax authorities, and that they were conspiring to cheat him out of his inheritance. His paranoia spiraled out of control, and he began to isolate himself further, convinced that he was the victim of betrayal by those he trusted most. Friends and colleagues later reported that Bird had expressed fears about his financial situation and even made vague threats about taking matters into his own hands. However, no one took his comments seriously, and there was no indication that Bird was planning the violent spree that would follow. Bird's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became increasingly withdrawn and his paranoia deepened. There is no evidence that Bird sought professional help for his mental health issues, nor is there any indication that he had been previously diagnosed with a serious mental illness. Nonetheless, his behavior became more erratic, and the pressure from his financial problems exacerbated his sense of persecution. Eventually, Bird was consumed by a belief that his life was falling apart and that those around him were responsible for his suffering. His isolation, lack of emotional support, and inability to resolve his financial troubles created a perfect storm that led to his eventual breakdown. June 10, 2010 began like any other day in Cumbria. The weather was typical for a summer day in northern England, and the small communities of Whitehaven, Egremont, and Seascale were going about their usual routines. But by the end of the day, the peaceful quiet would be replaced by terror, confusion, and grief. The rampage began in the morning at around 10:20 a.m. Derek Bird's first target was his twin brother, David Bird. Derek drove to his brother's home in Lamplow and shot him dead. After killing his brother, he headed to the home of Kevin Commons, his solicitor, just a short drive away. Commons was in his driveway when Derek arrived. Derek shot him dead as well, believing that his solicitor had betrayed him over his financial troubles. These two murders were premeditated and personal, driven by Derek's delusions about a conspiracy against him. Following these two targeted killings, Derek Bird's rampage became far more random and unpredictable. Armed with a .22 caliber rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun, both of which he legally owned, Bird drove into Whitehaven, where he worked as a taxi driver. His next victim was Darren Rucastle. Bird shot and killed Rucastle at the taxi rank in the town centre, in full view of several witnesses. This event marked the point at which the scale of Bird's spree became clear. From Whitehaven, Bird drove through the small towns and villages of West Cumbria, firing his weapons at random passers-by. His victims were a mix of people he knew and complete strangers. As he drove through towns like Egremont, Gosforth, and Seascale, Bird's shooting spree became more and more erratic. He shot cyclists, motorists, and pedestrians, indiscriminately targeting anyone he came across. Some of the victims included people like Susan Hughes, a 68-year-old grandmother who was walking home from shopping in Egremont when Bird shot her. Another victim was 64-year-old Michael Pike, who was cycling near Seascale when Bird drove by and fired his rifle at him. In some cases, the people Bird shot survived, though many were left with life-changing injuries. As the rampage unfolded, Bird's erratic behaviour left the police and emergency services scrambling to respond. Cumbria's rural landscape and the tight-knit communities made it difficult for people to track Bird's movements. He drove through the remote country roads Occasionally stopping to refuel or change direction, a massive manhunt was launched, with helicopters and armed police dispatched across the region to try and stop Bird before more lives were lost. By the time Bird's rampage ended, 12 people had been killed and 11 others were seriously injured. The violence spanned across more than 25 miles of rural Cumbria. Bird's final act of violence occurred near the village of Boot, where he abandoned his car and fled on foot into the woods. At approximately 1 p.m, Bird turned one of the guns on himself. The aftermath of the Cumbria shootings left the country reeling. The random nature of Bird's attacks, combined with the fact that many of his victims were ordinary people going about their daily lives, made the massacre particularly shocking. Communities across Cumbria were left in mourning, and the quiet rural region would never be the same. In late 2006, the quiet English town of Ipswich was thrust into a national spotlight for reasons no one could have imagined. Over the span of just a few weeks in November and December, 5 women, Gemma Adams, Tanya Nicole, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nichols, were found murdered in the surrounding Suffolk countryside. These tragic events, now known as the Ipswich murders, not only shocked the local community, but also gripped the entire UK, sparking a massive police investigation and intense media scrutiny. All 5 women were involved in the sex work industry, and their disappearance occurred within a relatively short time frame, leading investigators to believe they were dealing with a serial killer. Each victim disappeared from the red light district of Ipswich, a close-knit and vulnerable community where sex workers often knew each other. As the bodies were discovered in quick succession, fear spread rapidly among the women still working in the area and the general public. The first victim, Tanya Nicole, was reported missing on October 30th, 2006. Her body was found on December 8th in a stream near the village of Copdock, several miles from Ipswich. Just 6 days later, on December 12th, the body of Gemma Adams, who had been missing since November 15th, was found in the same stream. Both bodies were discovered nude, and neither showed signs of sexual assault, though the exact causes of death for both women could not be determined due to the state of decomposition. By this point, it was clear that the police knew they were dealing with a serial offender, and the investigation ramped up in scale. However, the horror was far from over. On December 10th, the body of 24-year-old Annalie Alderton was found in a wooded area near the village of Nacton. Unlike the previous victims, Alderton's cause of death was immediately apparent. She had been strangled. It was also revealed that Alderton was 3 months pregnant at the time of her death, adding a particularly tragic layer to the case. As the days went on, the tension in Ipswich continued to build. The media descended on the town, and the sense of fear was palpable, especially among sex workers, many of whom were afraid to continue working but felt they had no other option. On December 12th, 2 more bodies were discovered in the open countryside near Levington, Paula Clennell and Annette Nichols. Clennell, like Alderton, had been strangled. She had previously given an interview to the media just days before her death, in which she explained why she continued to work despite the growing dangers.
Why have you decided to come out tonight?
Because I need the money. I need the money, you know.
Despite the dangers?
Well, that has made me a bit wary about getting into cars, you know.
But presumably you will do that tonight?
Well, probably.
Her words about having to earn money to survive haunted the public after her body was found. Annette Nichols was also discovered near the same location. She too had been strangled, and her body had been left in an especially degraded manner, as the killer had posed her in a way that suggested he took pleasure in the act. The murder of 5 women in such a short period of time put enormous pressure on the police to find the perpetrator before more lives were lost. The police investigation, known as Operation Sumac, became one of the largest and most high-profile manhunts in British history. Detectives knew they were facing a brutal and organised killer. But despite the mounting pressure, they maintained a systematic approach. Investigators combed through CCTV footage, traced the last known movements of the victims, and interviewed countless people in the area. They also reached out to women still working in the sex trade for information, but the level of fear and distrust made gathering details a slow process. One of the key breakthroughs came from forensic evidence. Fibers found on several of the victims' bodies were traced to a specific vehicle, a Ford Mondeo, which ultimately led to the arrest of 48-year-old Steve Wright on December 19, 2006. Wright lived in Ipswich and, like many of the women, had connections to the town's red light district. He was known to have frequented sex workers and had been seen in the area around the time the women went missing. What made Steve Wright's capture even more chilling was that he lived only a short distance from where the victims were last seen, as he continued living a seemingly normal life while carrying out the murders. Wright, a former steward and forklift driver, had a quiet but troubled history. His personal life was riddled with failed relationships, and he had struggled with mounting debts. He had previously lived in several different parts of the UK, and during his time working on a cruise ship, he was known to have had relationships with sex workers. However, nothing in his past suggested he was capable of such violence, at least not until the Ipswich murders. In January 2008, Steve Wright stood trial for the murder of all 5 women. The case against him was built on strong forensic evidence, including DNA traces and fiber links that tied him to the victims. Although he denied the charges, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Wright did not testify in his defense, and after only 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The Ipswich murders had a profound and lasting impact on the community, particularly on the safety and protection of sex workers. The vulnerability of the victims highlighted the dangerous conditions faced by many in the industry. For the families of the victims, the pain of losing their loved ones in such a horrific manner has never faded. The women were not just victims of a serial killer, they were daughters, mothers, and friends whose lives were brutally cut short. And the legacy of the Ipswich murders has continued to influence debates around the protection and rights of sex workers in the UK. What made the Ipswich murders particularly haunting was not just the speed and brutality of the killings, but the sheer ordinariness of the man behind them. Steve Wright was not a criminal mastermind or a known predator before his arrest. He was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, hiding in plain sight. His ability to blend in with the community only added to the terror that gripped Ipswich during those fateful weeks in late 2006. The Hungerford Massacre, which took place on August 19, 1987, stands as one of the most shocking mass shootings in British history. On that hot summer day, a 27-year-old man went on a deadly rampage in the small market town of Hungerford, Berkshire. The event left the UK reeling and led to significant changes in the country's gun laws, making it a pivotal moment in modern British history. Michael Ryan was born in May 1960 in the town of Hungerford. His early life was relatively unremarkable, and he grew up in a working-class family. He was described by those who knew him as a shy, introverted child, though nothing in his early life suggested the violence he would later unleash. As he got older, Ryan developed an interest in firearms, becoming somewhat obsessed with guns, survivalism, and military paraphernalia. Despite his fascination with weapons, there were few signs that he was capable of the horrors that would later unfold. Ryan lived with his mother, Dorothy, who worked as a dinner lady at a local school. He had a troubled history with relationships, never marrying or establishing close friendships. Some who knew him claimed that Ryan had an inflated sense of self-importance, but he was largely seen as a quiet loner, someone who kept to himself. His obsession with firearms was well known, and he legally owned several guns, including semi-automatic rifles and handguns, an alarming reality in hindsight, considering what would come to pass. On the morning of August 19, 1987, Michael Ryan set out on a rampage that would devastate the small community of Hungerford. He began his day setting fire to his home, leaving the house to burn with his mother's body inside. Dorothy was his first victim, including a semi-automatic rifle, a Beretta pistol, and an M1 carbine. Ryan embarked on a shooting spree that would claim the lives of 16 people, many of them random bystanders who had the misfortune of crossing his path. The massacre began at Savermake Forest, just outside Hungerford, where Ryan shot Susan Godfrey, a mother of 2, in front of her children. She was picnicking in the area when Ryan approached her, forced her away from the children at gunpoint, and shot her multiple times. This chilling act marked the beginning of a killing spree that would last several hours and terrorize the entire town. After killing Godfrey, Ryan drove back into Hungerford, shooting indiscriminately at pedestrians and motorists. He made his way through residential streets, firing at anyone who happened to be nearby. Some victims were people he knew, but most were strangers, ordinary citizens caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the most tragic aspects of the Hungerford massacre was how quickly and arbitrarily lives were taken. People were shot in their home, on the street, or while driving their cars, with no clear pattern or motive behind Ryan's choices. Ryan's next target was 51-year-old Kenneth Clements, who was out walking with his family. Clements attempted to shield his wife and son, but Ryan shot and killed him on the spot. Ryan then moved toward the town centre, firing at passing cars and houses. Many residents were trapped inside their homes, listening in horror as gunfire echoed through the streets. Some tried to escape, while others barricaded themselves inside, hoping the gunmen would pass by without noticing them. One of Ryan's victims was 66-year-old Francis Butler, a pensioner who was shot through his kitchen window as he tried to close the curtains. Another victim, 84-year-old Abdul Khan, was killed in front of his wife in their garden as they worked on their flowers. The randomness and brutality of these murders shook the town to its core. The people of Hungerford were unprepared for such a violent act, especially in a place where crime was rare and the community was close-knit. Ryan's rampage continued as he moved through the town, at one point shooting and wounding several police officers who responded to the scene. Constable Roger Brereton, one of the first officers to arrive, was shot and killed while sitting in his patrol car. The sense of chaos intensified as police struggled to control the situation. At the time, law enforcement in the UK was not routinely armed, and officers arriving on the scene were unprepared for the level of firepower Ryan possessed. Ryan's shooting spree reached a climax when he entered a Hungerford school. Thankfully, the school was closed for the summer holidays, meaning no children or staff were inside at the time. Ryan eventually holed up in a classroom and engaged in a tense standoff with the police. Throughout this period, he was reportedly calm, showing no signs of panic or distress despite the carnage he had caused. He made no demands and gave no clear explanation for his actions. After several hours of the standoff, Ryan turned one of his guns on himself, ending his life and bringing the massacre to a close. In the immediate aftermath, the town of Hungerford was left devastated, and the entire country was in shock. The randomness of the killings, the vulnerability of the victims, and the sheer scale of the attack were incomprehensible to many. Michael Ryan had no history of mental illness, no known political or ideological motive, and no personal grievances with most of his victims. The lack of a clear reason for the attack made it even more difficult for the public to understand. The Hungerford massacre had a lasting effect on the UK. One of the most significant consequences was the tightening of gun control laws. In the wake of the shooting, the government quickly moved to introduce the 1988 Firearms Amendment Act, which banned the ownership of semi-automatic rifles and restricted access to other types of firearms. This legislation was part of a broader effort to prevent similar massacres in the future, and it represented one of the most significant changes to gun laws in British history. The massacre also left lasting scars on the community of Hungerford. Survivors and families of the victims struggled with grief and trauma, and the town itself became synonymous with one of the most tragic events in modern British history. In the years since, Michael Ryan's motives have remained largely mysterious. Some psychological profiles have suggested that Ryan may have been dealing with deep-seated issues related to his isolation, his obsession with firearms, and possibly even unresolved mental health issues. However, no definitive explanation for his actions has ever emerged. The Hungerford massacre remains one of the most disturbing examples of senseless mass violence in British history, a reminder of how quickly and unexpectedly tragedy can strike. Michael Ryan's actions on that August day highlighted the devastating consequences of unchecked access to weapons and the potential for seemingly ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary acts of violence. Lucy Letby was an ordinary young woman in many respects, but behind the facade of normalcy, she concealed dark and chilling secrets. Letby was born in Hereford in 1990 into what seemed like a typical middle-class family. Described by friends and neighbours as a quiet, caring and dedicated person, she grew up with a strong interest in healthcare and nurturing others. After completing her schooling, Lucy attended the University of Chester, where she studied nursing. During her studies, she specialised in neonatal care, drawn to the idea of helping premature babies and infants born with medical complications. Her professional career began when she was hired at the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital. To all appearances, Lucy was well liked by her colleagues and respected for her work ethic. She had a cheerful demeanour and was known for taking extra care of the most vulnerable babies in the unit. No one suspected that beneath this image of compassion and professionalism, Lucy Letby harboured a darker inclination. Between June 2015 and June 2016, a series of unexplained deaths and medical emergencies occurred in the neonatal unit where Lucy worked. At first, these deaths were chalked up to natural causes or the unfortunate complications that sometimes come with premature births. But as the number of deaths and near-fatal incidents mounted, concerns grew. Many of the babies who died or collapsed were otherwise stable or had been showing signs of improvement before suddenly deteriorating while under Lucy's care. Colleagues noticed that she often seemed to be present when these medical emergencies occurred, but initially, no one could have imagined that a nurse, someone entrusted with the care of fragile newborns, could be responsible for their harm. The first real suspicion arose when one doctor began noticing a troubling pattern. Dr. Stephen Breary, a senior consultant, raised concerns after 3 babies unexpectedly died within 2 weeks. After reviewing medical records, it became apparent that Lucy was on duty each time a baby died or suffered a near-fatal collapse. Breary's concerns grew, but despite his attempts to alert hospital management, no immediate action was taken. Hospital officials were reluctant to believe that one of their own staff could be behind these events, and Letby remained in her position, continuing to care for babies in the unit. As more babies died or experienced mysterious collapses, further investigations were launched. In total, the hospital saw a significant rise in neonatal deaths during the year Lucy was working on the unit, far higher than the national average for similar neonatal wards. Babies who had been doing well would suddenly suffer catastrophic events, such as unexpected drops in oxygen levels, heart failure, or severe bleeding. Some babies showed symptoms of air embolisms or had insulin injected into their systems, acts that would only be detectable through post-mortem investigations or detailed medical tests. One of the most striking aspects of Lucy's crimes was the variety of methods she was used to harm her victims. Evidence presented during her trial showed that she injected air into the bloodstreams or stomachs of some babies, administered insulin or other medicines inappropriately, and tampered with feeding tubes. The babies she targeted were among the most vulnerable, those born prematurely or with other medical conditions that required intensive care. In many cases, Lucy's actions would cause sudden severe deterioration in a baby's health, leading to either death or long-term medical complications. As the deaths continued, hospital management finally suspended Lucy from clinical duties in 2016. However, it took 2 more years for police to launch a full criminal investigation. In 2018, Lucy Letby was arrested after detectives gathered extensive evidence linking her to the suspicious deaths and collapses. Investigators uncovered handwritten notes in Lucy's home, some of which read like confessions. One chilling note simply said, "I am evil. I did this." Other notes revealed her deep psychological torment, suggesting that Lucy herself may have been grappling with guilt, but these admissions came too late for her victims. The trial, which began in October 2022, revealed the full scope of Lucy's crimes. Prosecutors detailed how she had deliberately harmed the infants in her care, often targeting the most fragile babies. What made her actions even more horrifying was that she didn't just kill her victims outright. Many of them suffered prolonged pain and medical crisis before succumbing to their injuries. Some babies survived her attacks, but were left with lifelong disabilities as a result. During the trial, the court heard harrowing testimony from parents of the victims, many of whom had no idea that their babies were deliberately harmed until the investigation unfolded. For these parents, the anguish was unimaginable, trusting their newborns to the care of a trained nurse, only to discover that she had intentionally caused their suffering. Despite the overwhelming evidence, including Lucy's own incriminating notes and detailed medical records showing her presence at the time of each incident, she maintained her innocence throughout the trial. Lucy offered no clear motive for her actions, leaving the investigators, families, and the public to speculate on why a seemingly caring and dedicated nurse would turn into a killer. Some have suggested that she enjoyed the control and attention that came with being involved in a medical crisis, while others theorized that Lucy may have been motivated by deeper psychological issues related to her need for validation or to act as a hero figure during emergencies. However, no definitive psychological explanation has emerged, and Lucy has never provided a full confession. The verdict came in August 2023, when Lucy Letby was found guilty of 7 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, described Lucy's crime as a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder. The sheer scale of her crimes, the deliberate methods she employed, and the fact that she preyed on the most vulnerable members of society make her one of the most notorious serial killers in modern British history. The aftermath of her crimes has been far-reaching, not only for the families of the victims, but also for the hospital and the healthcare system in the UK. Many have questioned why concerns raised by Lucy's colleagues weren't acted upon sooner, and how someone with access to such fragile lives could have gone undetected for so long. On the morning of March 13, 1996, the quiet Scottish town of Dunblane was forever scarred by one of the most tragic events in British history. What began as a typical school day at Dunblane Primary School turned into an unthinkable nightmare. The man responsible for this nightmare was 43-year-old Thomas Hamilton, a former scout leader who had a history of erratic behaviour and a deep-seated grudge against local authorities. Thomas Hamilton was born on May 10, 1952, in Glasgow, Scotland. From a young age, his upbringing was unstable. He was raised by his grandparents after his father abandoned the family shortly after his birth. His mother later remarried and moved away, leaving Hamilton to grow up believing that his grandparents were his actual parents and that his biological mother was his older sister. It wasn't until later in his childhood that Hamilton discovered the truth about his family, which reportedly had a profound and lasting psychological impact on him. This early sense of abandonment and confusion may have contributed to his lasting feelings of isolation and bitterness. As Hamilton grew older, he struggled to form lasting, meaningful relationships. He developed a keen interest in working with children in youth groups, particularly through his involvement with the Boy Scouts. Initially, this gave him a sense of purpose. In the 1970s, Hamilton became a scout leader and began organizing camping trips for boys in the local area. However, it wasn't long before parents and other adults grew concerned about his behavior. Hamilton was described by many as socially awkward, controlling, and, at times, inappropriate with the young boys in his care. Numerous complaints were made about the way he managed the boys during camping trips, including allegations that he was overly authoritarian and displayed an unhealthy interest in the boys' physical development. He would insist on photographing the boys, often shirtless or in swimming trunks, under the guise of organizing activities. In 1974, the Boy Scouts of Britain took action. Following an internal investigation into his behaviour, Thomas Hamilton was dismissed from his role as a scout leader. The reasons for his dismissal were not made public at the time, but the allegations against him were serious enough that local scout leaders and parents demanded his removal. This expulsion from the Scouts was a turning point in Hamilton's life. From this point forward, his sense of rejection and persecution began to intensify. He became convinced that local authorities, including the police and the parents in his community, were conspiring against him. This belief was compounded by his failed attempts to establish his own boys' clubs and summer camps. Hamilton tried on several occasions to set up new clubs for boys, but each time concerns from parents about his behaviour led to his clubs being shut down. He interpreted these closures as further evidence of a conspiracy designed to ruin his reputation. Hamilton's life outside of his obsession with youth groups was equally solitary and troubled. He lived alone in a small house in Stirling, Scotland, and had few close friends. Many neighbours and acquaintances described him as odd and reclusive. His fixation on youth organisations, coupled with his growing sense of social isolation, created a man who was both resentful and increasingly unhinged. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Hamilton's grievances only deepened. He continued to file complaints and petitions against those he believed had wronged him, but to no avail. His behaviour became more erratic, and he was seen less frequently in public, retreating further into his isolation. All the while, he maintained a small collection of legally owned firearms, which he used for target shooting at local ranges. His interest in guns would ultimately become the instrument of his violence. In the years leading up to that day in 1996, Hamilton's desperation and bitterness reached a breaking point. He was now in his mid-40s, socially ostracized, and living in a bubble of paranoia and anger. His repeated failures to re-establish himself as a leader in the community, coupled with what he saw as endless rejection, caused him to harbor growing rage towards the people he blamed for his downfall. This rage became fixated on Dunblane Primary School, where he had tried and failed to organize a youth club. At 9:30 a.m. on March 13, 1996, Hamilton entered the gym at Dunblane Primary School, where a class of 29 children, aged 5 and 6, was in the middle of a PE lesson. Armed with legally owned handguns, Hamilton opened fire indiscriminately. The children and their teacher, Gwen Mayer, had little time to react. Mayer instinctively tried to protect the children, but Hamilton was relentless. Within a matter of minutes, 16 children and their teacher lay dead. Another 15 children were injured, some severely, though miraculously many survived, either by playing dead or by being shielded by their classmates. What makes the Dunblane massacre particularly horrifying is the age of the victims. These were young children, many just beginning their lives. The senselessness of the attack left the entire community, and indeed, the entire country, in shock. Parents, teachers, and first responders were left grappling with the scale of loss and the brutal way it was inflicted. Hamilton continued his rampage for only a few minutes before he turned the gun on himself. By the time the police arrived, the carnage was over, but the devastation was only just beginning. The surviving children, along with families of those lost, were left to confront a lifetime of grief, trauma, and unanswered questions. In the immediate aftermath, the country demanded change. The massacre reignited a long-standing debate over gun control in the UK, with many calling for a complete overhaul of the laws governing firearm ownership. The public outcry reached Parliament, and in 1997, less than a year after the massacre, the Firearms Amendment Act was passed. This legislation effectively banned the private ownership of handguns in the UK, with very few exceptions. It was one of the strictest pieces of gun control legislation in the world, and it was largely driven by the memory of Dunblane and a desire to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. But the effects of the Dunblane massacre extended beyond legislation. The small town of Dunblane became a symbol of both immense loss and incredible resilience. The massacre also had a profound impact on public figures like tennis star Andy Murray, who was a student at Dunblane Primary School at the time of the attack. Murray, along with his brother Jamie, was at the school during the massacre, but was not in the gym when the shooting occurred. In later years, Andy Murray has spoken about the lasting emotional effects of the day, though he rarely discusses it in depth, preferring to focus on the resilience of the Dunblane community.
A few years ago, you mentioned you began researching it and looking into what happened a lot. Why was that important to you to do?
Well, I think it's going to be a pretty important part of anybody's life, something like that. It's a very personal thing. And yeah, well, I was obviously very young when it happened, so I had limited knowledge of how big an event it was and exactly what had happened, and just important to know. You know, I just wanted to know. I was very curious about it. It's something I probably tried to kind of black out from my memory, and it's still not something I particularly enjoy talking about.
For those who lived through the events of March 13th, 1996, the pain of that day will never fully fade. The Dunblane massacre is one of those moments in history that will forever be etched into the collective memory of the nation. The raw grief, the shocking loss of innocent life, and the heroic actions of teachers like Gwen Mayer left an indelible mark, shaping conversations around gun control and public safety for years to come. And that's the end of the video, folks. This is my first real video after being hacked a little over a week ago. The hacking kind of killed my channel's presence in the algorithm, so I'm going to have to work my way back into it. I'm going to try to pump out another video in less than a month, so look out for that. Be sure to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe if you're new, because I really need it right now, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.